27 Tribal-class destroyers were built, 16 for the Royal Navy, 8 for the Royal Canadian Navy, and 3 for the Australian Navy, aka the Royal Australian Navy. I always just call it the Aussie Navy, personally. So in today's video, I'll go over the 3 Australian Tribal-class destroyers from oldest to youngest, based on their date of their commissioning into the Royal Australian Navy. Now, I do apologize if I mispronounce the name. I will do my best, and do listen to audio of the names via Google, but I may still mess them up since they are typically said multiple times. And once again, it is unintentional, and I will try my best to not do that. Now, all 3 were built by the Cockatoo Island Dry Dock in Sydney, Australia, and no other nation tribals were all built in the same place. For the Canadian ones, not all were even built in Canada. Now, onto the first ship on this list. The first of the Australian tribals, HMCS Arunta, was named after the Arunta people. She was laid down on November 15th, 1939, launched on November 30th, 1940, and got stuck halfway down, so she was completely launched on December the 1st. She was commissioned on March 30th, 1942, and went on to get 5 battle honors: Pacific 42-45, New Guinea 42-44, Leyte Gulf 44, Lingayen Gulf 1945, and finally Borneo 1945. Her motto was Conquer or Die, which, in my opinion, is a very good motto for a naval ship. She underwent her last overhaul from 1949 to 52 to become an anti-submarine destroyer. Arunta was decommissioned on December 21st, 1956, having only actually actively served for about 11 years, and she sat in operational reserve for 12 until November 1st, 1968, when she was sold to China Steel Corporation for scrap. On February 12, 1969, the Japanese tug Tokyo Maru took the Arunta under tow to be scrapped. On February 13, 1969, a day after the tow began, she began to take on water. Attempts were made to stop the flooding, but it was decided that saving her wasn't possible, and she was allowed to capsize and sink off Broken Bay. Of the 13 tribals sunk, only 2 weren't British, and only 1 wasn't sunk during wartime, the Arunta. The only other non-British tribal to sink was HMCS Athabaskan, the first of 3. HMCS Arunta's rearmost 4.7-inch, 120mm twin turret is preserved at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. During her career, she sailed 357,257 miles, the second most of any of the 3 tribals in Australia. So, 1 sunk on the way to be scrapped. So, let's get on to her sister ship and the second Australian tribal. The second Australian tribal, HMAS Warramunga, named after the Warramunga people of Central Australia, was laid down on February 10, 1940, launched on February 7, 1942, and commissioned on November 23, 1942. Her motto was Courage in Difficulties, which also quite a nice motto for a naval ship. Just like her sister, Warramunga would survive both World War II and the Korean War, and she would go on to earn 6 battle honors: Pacific 42-45, New Guinea 42-45, Leyte Gulf 44, Lingayen Gulf 1945, Borodino 1945, and Korea 1950-52. Warramunga was decommissioned on December 7, 1959, and marked for disposal on May 22nd of 1961. She was sold to Kinoshita and Company Limited on February 15, 1963. Warramunga would then be towed and scrapped in Japan. Warramunga's 1943 ship's badge, made by American sailors during World War II, is preserved and on display in the Warramunga Bar at the Balmoral RSL Club. During her career, she sailed 525,000 miles, almost as much as her 2 sisters combined. So, now we have 1 sunk on the way to be scrapped, 1 scrapped. Now, on to the last of the 3 Australian tribal class destroyers. The third and final Australian tribal was HMAS Bataan, named after the American stand during the Battle of Bataan, one of the few tribals not named after a tribe. She was originally named Chinguili, and then her night before construction started, but was renamed for a third time to Bataan prior to her launch. She was laid down on February 18, 1942, launched on January 15, 1944, and commissioned on May 25, 1945, and not completed in time to participate in World War II, besides being present for the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. She would, however, see service in Korea and got her first and only battle honor, Korea 1950-52. She was decommissioned on October 18, 1954, and laid up in reserve awaiting conversion, like Aruta, to an anti-submarine escort, but this was cancelled in 1957, and she was placed for the disposal list and sold for scrap to the Tea Car and Company of Sydney in 1958. The ship's plaque and badges are preserved at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Kind of fitting, her sister's twin turret is also there. They also have a Japanese flag signed by 55 of her crew members during the Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945. Bataan sailed 279,394 miles in her career, the shortest career and the lowest miles between her and her 2 sisters. So, in a recap, Australia's 3 tribal class destroyers are all long gone. In fact, only one is left of any of the original 27. 13 sunk, 13 scrapped, and Haida lives alone. But at least she's still here with us. Now, there also isn't much preserved of any of them, which, in my opinion, is a shame. It would have been nice for a little bit more of them to be preserved, but a little bit is much better than nothing. So the first sunk undertow 4 scrap and 2 were scrapped. The fleet had a combined 1,161,669 miles in their service careers, 525,000 of which were Warramungas. She just had to flex over her sisters. They might not be as well known as some of the British and Canadian tribals, but they still deserve to be remembered. The tribal class destroyers are my favorite destroyers of all time. Haida is my favorite ship of all time, tied with the Paddle Wheel Princess. And these 3, while they may not be high on the list, they're still in the top 100. And carriers aren't usually associated with the Royal Canadian Navy, just like battleships. However, unlike battleships, which Canada never operated, we did have 3 aircraft carriers, although never more than one was in active service for any given time, and none since July 3rd, 1970, over 55 years ago. So in today's video, I'll go over the fates of all 3 Canadian carriers, which were all lake carriers built by Harland and Wolff, 2 of them, numbers 1 and 2, built side by side. Now, Canada during World War II did operate 2 escort carriers for the British. As they were built by America and then lend-leased, the British could not loan them to Canada. So they're in British commission, not Canadian. And the crew were a mix of British and Canadian, so for this list, I'm not technically counting them. So, let's go over the fate of all 3 true Canadian carriers from first to the very last. And coming in at number 3. The first of the Canadian carriers, the Colossus class HMCS Warrior. Warrior was laid down for the Royal Navy as HMS Warrior on December 12, 1942. Launched on May 20th, 1944, and commissioned on April 2nd, 1945, before being transferred to Canada and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on March 14th, 1946. She would serve in Canada until her decommissioning and return to the Royal Navy on March 23rd, 1948. 2 days earlier, she, however, gained a fleet mate. However, it was just for those 2 days. Her decommissioning ended the first service of the very first Canadian carrier. There was one very simple problem with her that really made her suck for Canada. She had no heaters for the equipment. We get very cold in the winters, so heaters are very much necessary. The budget wouldn't support two carriers, so when Magnificent was ready, Warrior was returned to the UK, ending her short Canadian service. She would then be recommissioned into the Royal Navy in November 1948. Decommissioned in February 1958 and sold to Argentina, she was decommissioned and scrapped in 1971, ending the career of the first Canadian aircraft carrier. As far as I could find, nothing was saved from her, which is sad, but not really unsurprising given the fact that she wasn't historic, there's nothing really notable. So, coming in at number 2. The middle Canadian carrier, HMCS Magnificent, also known as the Maggie, was a Majestic-class light carrier, and she was the second to serve in Canada. She was ordered, like Warrior, for the Royal Navy as HMS Magnificent. She was laid down on July 29, 1943, launched on November 16, 1944, and loaded Canada along with Warrior. However, unlike Warrior, she was not finished, so she wouldn't end up being commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy until March 21, 1948, 2 days before Warrior was decommissioned, because the budget. It's always the budget, and Warrior didn't have her heaters anyways, so good choice. She was decommissioned on June 14, 1957, having never served during the Korean War, as she was already committed to NATO duties at the time. And frankly, the Americans had enough carriers to deal with them themselves. She served alongside her replacement from January 17, 1957 to June 14, 1957, although she had been in the UK since April of 57, so it was even shorter of a time, where they actually could have sailed together, although, as far as I'm aware, they never did. As in April, she was preparing for her return to the Royal Navy's custody. However, she would never actually serve again, and she was cut up in False Lane in July 1965, having only ever served in the Royal Canadian Navy. Now, unlike Warrior, a few of her planes do survive in various museums, but nothing as far as I could find of the ship herself, not a bell, not an anchor, nothing survives today, just like Warrior. So, let's move on to the final, and by far the most known and most loved Canadian carrier. Coming in at number 1 is good old Bonnie herself, the third and final Canadian carrier, and the second Majestic class built alongside her sister Magnificent, HMCS Bonaventure. Now, back in 1952, Canada was already coming up with their plan to replace Magnificent. And the UK offered Canada a Hermes-class light carrier, which was too expensive, and the Americans offered to loan 2 Essex-class fleet carriers, which would have been amazing. But because budgets, Canada chose HMS Powerful, which was built alongside, at the time HMS, later HMCS Magnificent. Powerful's construction had been halted until Canada acquired her and renamed her Bonaventure. She was laid down on November 27, 1943, launched on February 27, 1945, acquired by Canada on April 23, 1951, and commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy on January 17, 1957. She was decommissioned on July 3, 1970, having never really fought a war, just like her older fleet mates. Bonnie's decommissioning ended the era of the Canadian aircraft carriers. She was scrapped in Taiwan in 1971, the same year as the first Canadian carrier, HMCS Warrior, was scrapped in Argentina, and 6 years after her sister Magnificent in the UK. However, unlike her two former fleet mates, we actually have a little bit of her preserved, which is nice. Her bell is preserved at the Shearwater Aviation Museum. One anchor is at the Point Pleasant Park in Halifax, her home port, and the home port for Canadian carriers, and another at a military college in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, Quebec. I hope I said that right. 2 of her signal guns are now at HMCS Discovery, and a few planes are scattered around in various museums, just like Magnificent. But at least she has some of her preserved. And that's far better than nothing, and far better than the two previous carriers, including her sister. So, in a recap, all three Canadian aircraft carriers are long gone. They've long since all been scrapped, with very little to remember them by. Orion and Magnificent are often forgotten, as most of the time when it's brought up, it's Bonaventure that's brought up. And most people really only remember her as she was the last, and by far the most loved of the three. Canada has never had a fleet carrier. The closest they got was potentially getting the two Essexes offered by the USA, although I don't know which two they specifically would have been. It just proved too expensive for Canada to have a fleet carrier, which is sad. I would have loved to have seen Canada with a fleet carrier, but maybe that's just my bias. Now, all three may be long gone, but they, especially good old Bonnie, deserve to be remembered.
It's the tribal class destroyers of both the Royal Navy, the Royal Australian Navy, where it was the first episode of the Fate Of series, and my favorite, with some bias, the Royal Canadian Navy. So, in the third edition of Fate Of, I will go over the fates of all three HMCS Athabascans, two of which are tribals, and the third is unofficially nicknamed a tribal. So, coming in at number 3. My favorite Athabascan, and one of my favorite ships. HMCS Athabascan G07. Motto, we fight as one. Athabascan was built by Vickers Armstrong in Newcastle upon Tyne. She was ordered on April 5th, 1940, laid down on October 31st, 1940, launched on November 15th, 1941, and commissioned on February 3rd, 1943. She would receive the following battle honors: Arctic 1943-44, and English Channel 1944. And it would be in the English Channel on April 19th, 1944, where she was patrolling with her sister and my favorite ship, tied with the paddle wheel princess, HMCS Haida, in support of British mining operations off the coast of France. They were ordered to intercept German warships, which turned out to be 3 torpedo boats. Athabascan was potentially hit by shore batteries, although that is a gray area. What is known for sure is a torpedo struck her on the port side in her stern. And about 50 minutes later, there was a potential second explosion, but no one's sure if that was another torpedo hit or if that was from the ammunition magazines. In another analysis, she may have also been the victim of friendly fire from HMS MTB 677, a British torpedo boat covering mining operations. In the end, she sunk. Her wreck is in a shattered condition on the seabed, as found in 2004, so it's unlikely we will ever really know. Haida proceeded to drop her own motor cutter, needing to leave due to the rising sun and an increased risk of air and sea attacks. Now, the motor cutter rescued 2 of Haida's own crew who fell overboard when the nets were dropped before survivors when Haida departed. They also rescued 6 from Athabascan before making a long trip back to the UK. 44 were rescued by Haida herself, and 83 were taken as POWs by 3 German minesweepers, who arrived after Haida had left. 128 men, including her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Stubbs, who declined rescue by Haida to swim back to be with his remaining crew. Now, it was said when he was a few feet from Haida, he ordered his last known command, telling Haida to get out of here, E-boats. He could have easily been taken by Haida, but he refused to leave his men after ordering Haida to safety. Haida would later go on to destroy all 3 torpedo boats from that night, in multiple separate engagements, getting revenge for her fallen sister. Never mess with Haida. The fightingest ship in the Navy for a reason. In 2004, the Royal Canadian Navy provided a blast plaque to be laid on the wreck to commemorate her loss. Nothing from her is preserved except for one big part. Not from Athabascan herself, but HMCS Haida, formerly in Toronto and now in Hamilton, carrying on the legacy of her fallen sister. Near Bella Bella, British Columbia, an island was named Athabascan Island after her, and a school in the Belmont Park neighborhood of Collingwood, British Columbia, a suburb of Victoria, was named a Cole John Stubbs Memorial School after her commanding officer. Coming in at number 2, as the second Canadian Athabascan, HMCS Athabascan R79, and later DDE 219, nicknamed Athabascan 2 and Athabee, although I like to call her Athabay. It's just my personal one. She was the second and final tribal class destroyer to bear the name, although of course the next is an unofficial tribal. She was not named after the First Nations who shared the Athabascan language. She was named after her fallen sister, HMCS Athabascan G07, also sharing her motto of "We Fight as One." Unlike her lost sister Haida and several other of the earlier Canadian tribals, she, along with her 3 youngest siblings, were built by the Halifax shipyards in Halifax, Nova Scotia, although Athabascan herself was the last Canadian tribal built and the last to be commissioned of the global fleet of 27. She was laid down on May 15, 1943, launched on May 4, 1946, and commissioned on January 20, 1948. She was commissioned far too late to fight in World War II, but just in time for the Korean War, serving 3 tours. Before that, she had a mutiny of sorts in 1949, where 90 of her crew locked themselves in the mess deck, refusing to budge until the captain would hear their grievances. At the same time, similar incidents happened on both HMCS Crescent and the carrier HMCS Magnificent, who happens to be in the second episode of the Fate of series. It's a long story for another video, but to sum it up fairly quickly, all the captains avoided the word mutiny to avoid any potential legal issues for said crew, and the mutinies ended fairly quickly. Now, the first of her many Korean War tours started on July 5th, 1950, and she returned from her third and final one on December 11th, 1953. For her various actions during the war, she would earn her one and only battle honor, Korea 1950-53. Following her return, she underwent a major refit, re-entering service on October 25th, 1954, now as a destroyer escort, DDE 219. In January 1959, she left for the East Coast to join the tribal class squadron of her and her sisters. She was damaged in a collision with the last Canadian carrier, also in the previous Fate of episode, HMCS Bonaventure, Magnificent's younger sister, nicknamed Bonnie, in 1963. She was finally placed in reserve in 1964, formally decommissioned on April 21st, 1966, and sold for scrap in 1969, and finally scrapped in 1970 in Italy. Her bell is preserved at the Naval Museum of Halifax in Halifax, Nova Scotia. This ended her long service, but not the end of her name. Coming in at number 3 is the third and final of the 2026 HMCS Athabascan number 3, and the final of a once mighty fleet of Canadian destroyers, till the first of the River class comes online sometime in the early 2030s. To continue on the legacy. She was the third ship of the class, but the second completed, beating her older sister Huron by 2.5 months. The final Athabascan was built by Davies Shipbuilding in Liaison, Quebec, as an Iroquois-class destroyer, specifically member number 3. She was laid down on June 21st, 1969, the same year as the previous Athabascan was sold for scrap. The same day as her Huron, her older sister, or supposedly older sister. I guess you could argue they're the same age. Although Huron was at Marine Industries in Sorel, Quebec. Athabascan was launched on November 27, 1970, commissioned on September 30th, 1972. Her motto was the same as the 2 Athabascans before her: "We fight as one." She had a relatively interesting career, so here's a few of them. On November 26, 1971, her Sea King helicopter removed 44 people of the 62 people from the oil rig Rowan Juno, just off of Sable Island, as a drifting 576-foot Euro Princess was in danger of hitting it as she was drifting. She later grounded a mile from the oil rig as a tugboat was already on its way to assist and to stop it running into the oil rig. She underwent a refit in August 1990 for Operation Friction, part of Operation Desert Shield. She would be sent to the Persian Gulf in late 1990 and undertook escort duties in January 1991. On February 18, 1991, USS Tripoli and USS Princeton both struck mines while conducting operations in the Persian Gulf, being led to safety by HMCS Athabaskan, who finally got to have a slightly more quiet career. Once during the Gulf War, she underwent a sea-to-sea refueling from, of all ships, the mighty Iowa-class fast battleship, USS Wisconsin, Temper herself. And that's one of my favorite facts about her. She underwent the Trump refit, the Tribal Refit and Update Modernization Program. Oftentimes, the Iroquois class was just known as the Tribal class. Not after Donald Trump, the current president and the 45th president of the United States. Now, this needs its own video as it's far too long to cover here, and as I would cover all four sisters, as there were some differences in construction times for them. However, I do prefer the Iroquois class after the refit, just from a look standpoint. She was under this refit from October 1991 to August 1994. She would lose her first sister, Huron, when she was sunk in a live fire exercise off Vancouver Island on May 14, 2007, as the RCN didn't have the personnel for her. She had been decommissioned because of that in 2000, and was the most modern destroyer, having been the last to be completed in the Trump refit. So, they sunk her as an exercise. I personally maybe would have chosen one of the older ones, but I'm sure they had their reasons. Good or not, I'm sure they had them. She would lose her next sister, in fact the one she was built with, at Davies, HMCS Algonquin, when she was sold for scrap on November 27, 2015. Athabaskan would lose her last sister, the lead ship, Iroquois, built at Marine, like Huron, when she was sold for scrap on November 24, 2016, both Algonquin and Iroquois having been decommissioned in 2 separate months in 2015. Athabaskan would sail along alone for almost 2 years, when she was decommissioned on March 10, 2017. I just wish they waited until after Canada's 150th birthday celebrations on July 1st, 2017. I just think that would have been really cool if they could have had her participate in some way. Attempts were made to preserve her, but the government said no, wary as previous attempts with other ships had failed and became the government's problem. While her 2 scrap sisters were scrapped in Liverpool, Nova Scotia, Athabaskan herself, when sold for scrap in 2018, went to Sydney, Nova Scotia, ending not only her class, but the last of the Canadian destroyers, until the Type 26 frigates were classified as River-class destroyers only a few years ago, with the lead ship HMCS Fraser being expected to be commissioned in the early 2030s. When she was scrapped in 2018, it was the same year as the ship she helped all those 27 years ago, USS Tripoli, and USS Princeton still serves today. So, what's left of her? Well, just like Athabaskan number 2, I wish we had Athabaskan number 1's bell, but she has both of her bells preserved at the Naval Museum of Halifax, and that's all that I know. So in a recap, 1 sunk and 2 scrapped. 3 bells from the final 2, all preserved at the same museum. Athabaskans have belonged in the Navy since World War II, and now we have none. I don't know that they're going to plan any more to be named Athabaskan, let alone destroyers. The River class are all going to be named after the previous River class of destroyers. And they do want up to 12 brand new submarines, so maybe we'll get some submarines named after some tribals. Or maybe the vessels that end up replacing the Kingston class, if they make any, will be named after tribals. You can hope. I would doubt it, but you can always hope. The Royal Canadian Navy may not have had an Athabaskan since 2017, but all 3, especially the very first HMCS Athabaskan, deserve to be remembered.
It went from pre-dreadnoughts to dreadnoughts to the super dreadnoughts, and finally the fast battleships. So, today, in the 4th episode of Fate of, we will look at the fates of the first 2 American super battleships. However, they were not the first in the world. The British beat them to it. the two sisters of the New York-class Super Dreadnought fast battleships. They are the first 14-inch gunships in the American Navy. Now please note, the Fate of series are not history videos. While some is of course included, not a lot is, since this again is not a history series. That is for a completely different time. So, without further ado, let's get into the lead ship of the class. The younger member of the class, yet she's the lead ship and has the lower hull number, USS New York BB-34. She was ordered on May 1st, 1911 and built by the Brooklyn Navy Yard. However, her sister was not built here, which is not uncommon for the American dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts. She was laid down on September 11th, 1911, launched on October 30th, 1912, and commissioned on May 15th, 1914. She served in both World Wars, earning 6 battle honors: Mexican Service Medal, World War I Victory Medal with Grand Fleet Class, American Defense Service Medal, European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 1 battle star, and Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 2 battle stars, and her final World War II Victory Medal. However, unlike her sister, she did not fight during D-Day. After just over 32 years since her commissioning, the New York was decommissioned on August 29, 1946. However, before this, in July of 1946, she was one of many, many ships used for nuclear bomb testing at Bikini Atoll, also known as Operation Crossroads, surviving both tests, Able and Barker, like many other ships. She was towed to Pearl Harbor, and studies were done on the effects that the bombs had on her. She was stricken from the Naval Register on July 13, 1948, 7 days after she was sunk as a target ship on July 6, 1948. She's still at the bottom of the ocean today, and she always will be. I couldn't find if any parts of her were preserved, for example, a bell, an anchor, nameplates, things like that. Boulder plates aren't unnecessarily common for ships that are sunk as targets or as reefs to be saved, so it's a little weird when they aren't, especially with the lead ship of a class. So, what about her younger / somehow older sister? The younger hull number, but the older and final member of the class, USS Texas BB-35, built by the famous and still active to this very day, building submarines and aircraft carriers, Newport News Shipbuilding in Newport News, Virginia. She was ordered on June 24, 1910, laid down on April 17, 1911, launched on May 18, 1912, and commissioned on March 12, 1914, each step being finished before her sister. She went on to serve during both World Wars, just like the New York. However, she did fight during D-Day. In fact, during D-Day, she couldn't reach her last target as her guns did not have enough elevation. They were just a little too low. So, Texas being Texas, flooded her ballast tanks on one side to get the required angles, and then let her shells fly, and in fact finished her job. Now, her battle honors for both World War I and World War II, and a few others, are as follows in no particular order, and this will be a mouthful. The American Defense Service Medal, American Campaign Medal, European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 3 battle stars, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal with 2 battle stars, Navy Occupation Service Medal with Asia class, Mexican Service Medal, and the World War I Victory Medal. On April 17, 1947, the Battleship Texas Commission was created to care for the ship. On March 17, 1948, Texas left for her new home near the San Jacinto Monument at San Jacinto State Park, arriving on April 20th, 1948, and a day later, Texas was decommissioned on April 21st, 1948, and stricken on April 30th, 1948, 9 days later. However, she would be very poorly cared for, in part because of insufficient funds available to the commission. However, she was, despite all of this, including now a concrete instead of a wooden deck, designated a National Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in 1975. In 1976, she was designated a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. Texas was turned over to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department on August 31st, 1983, as the commission who had cared for her since 1948 was officially abolished. Texas underwent dry docking from 1988 to 1990, the first time since World War II, and just before coming to San Jacinto. She still wasn't out of danger, however, and continued to have the same problems of springing leaks, water getting in through various cracks in various different places, and rust, along with many other issues, as isn't uncommon with a ship her age. And again, this isn't a history video, so all that is for another day. However, she was not taken care of like an old ship needed to be. Finally, though, she would get her desperately needed repairs, as on August 31st, 2022, 39 years to the day after the Commission's abolishment, she was towed, and there was in fact a live stream of this. Although, there was also one of New Jersey when she went into dry dock a few years ago. Both those were very cool. And she was towed to a floating dry dock in Galveston, Texas, for her desperately needed maintenance, which included removing the torpedo blisters to replace a whole whack ton of steel. She would leave dry dock for a pier on March 5th, 2024, for repairs that could be done shoreside and not in a very expensive dry dock. And that is where she still sits today. The Battleship Texas Foundation, her current caretakers, hope for a grand reopening sometime this year in 2026. But of course, who knows for sure. However, she will not be returning to her berth in San Jacinto. Instead, she'll be at Pier 15 in Galveston, Texas, right in the same area she is now, although different pier. Or hopefully she'll get more visitors and in turn hopefully generate more money for her expensive upkeep, but really, only time will tell. She's the only surviving dreadnought of any kind afloat. Pre-dreadnought, normal dreadnought, and super dreadnought. And she's the lone survivor of the dreadnought and super dreadnoughts. However, one pre-dreadnought does survive, the British-built Japanese IJN Mikasa, commissioned in 1902, but has been encased in concrete since the 1920s. Texas turns 112 in a few weeks, and yet she's still around today, unlike so many before and after her. She may be seen by some as an expensive showboat, but to most, she's an irreplaceable part of history. So, in a recap, lower hull number, yet younger New York, has long since been sunk with nothing really to remember her by, except her sister, the USS Texas, the last remaining dreadnought/super dreadnought battleship preserved. There's one pre-dreadnought, the British-built Japanese IJN Mikasa, and 7 fast battleships, all American. 8 American battleships left, 1 British-built Japanese battleship left, for a grand total of only 9. 9 is a far cry from the once mighty worldwide fleet of battleships, but I'm sure we can all agree that 9 are much better than none.